Hey there, finance friends. Thank you for tuning in. So, in this next module, we're going to be shifting our focus from cash management into kind of like its cousin, credit management. Okay? So, we're going to be discussing in the next couple of lecture videos credit as a big concept. Credit is basically debt. When you think of credit, it basically means getting something now that you're going to pay for later. So when we talk about credit, we're also talking instinctively about debt. So we're going to be talking about credit and debt. And then I'm going to introduce you to the two primary ways that most Americans, most people utilize credit, either through loans to buy specific types of items or through credit cards. Okay? So we're going to have a couple of short videos. In this opening one, though, I want to set the stage for you, and I kind of want to outline some top level foundations of credit. So let's jump in and let's learn about credit. Okay, so number one, when we talk about credit at the foundational, big picture, top level, it's probably worth opening up by asking, what is credit? It's a pretty important opening question. And credit, I would offer to you, sort of has two meanings. So when we think about this term, we can think about it, and they're related, but we can think about the term credit as having two meanings. The first meaning, and the one that you're probably most familiar with, is a tool to get stuff. So when we think about credit, we can define credit as an arrangement to get goods and services or cash now and to pay for it later. So, on the one hand, we can think of credit as any arrangement, any mechanism, any tool that allows us to acquire goods or services or even cash today and pay for it later. Allows us to acquire goods, services, or cash today, but pay for it later. And that's really what most people think of, and that's what credit really is. Notice implicit in this definition, since you're getting stuff today and you're paying for it later, we know that this is basically debt. And we know that whenever you have debt, you're going to have to pay it back. And we know not only you have to pay it back, the amount that you borrowed, but you're also going to have to pay some interest. So we also start seeing a little bit of a systems lens of thinking here. We'll get back to that in a bit, but right away we're seeing, okay, we're talking about consumption today, about paying for it later. So we know there's some flow issues here. We know that you're basically consuming now and paying for it then in the future. So there's going to be some future claim on your income, right? We can imagine that's going to probably have an impact on our 50-30-20 model. So anyway, let's keep that big thing in mind. Credit's a tool that allows us to consume now, pay later. The second thing is just more of a conceptual idea. Credit is also a reflection of your overall trustworthiness. Now, I want to be clear. In this sense, when we say credit, this is like, oh, in other words, this meaning right here, meaning number one is, oh, I financed this house, I got a mortgage, I bought it on credit, or I used a credit card to buy it. This one here is more, I got a good loan because I have good credit. Or, oh man, I made some mistakes when I was young. I've got bad credit and I'm trying to fix my credit. So one of them is like a reflection based on your previous use of your overall trustworthiness with credit with other people's money. The other meaning, this one is actually what you use it for. Okay, they're used interchangeably, so just be aware of some of the jargon. When we talk about credit, we're also talking about a time component. In this first definition here, where we said you're getting things today, but paying for them later, we know that there's debt involved. Well, what does that mean? Well, you can think of this from a systems lens. Whenever there's debt, this means that current you is going to consume something today and push the bill to future you. So bear in mind that whenever you borrow money for something, current you is consuming it, future you is paying the price. So I'm not saying this is good or bad yet, but be aware that whenever you take on debt or utilize credit, current you is consuming and is pushing the bill to future you. This means that current you is getting an asset, the thing that you bought with the credit, but also taking on a liability. You have to pay it back. And you know that future you is going to be paying it back. This means that future you has a claim on their income. So let's be aware of these things. Let's also be aware that this movement right here, from current you to future you, this is a movement through time. So our TVM, our time value concepts are going to come into play here. Specifically, the debt is going to carry interest. And that interest is going to be moving across time. So we're going to need to be familiar with our concepts of present value and future value, NI and PMT, because we're going to use some of these ideas to do some simple time value calculations, okay? So just bear in mind this. From a systems lens, so we see what this is right here. We see that current you is going to take on stuff that future you is going to pay for. How does this look from a systems lens? Well, there's a couple ways that we can look at it. Number one, we know that you're going to have your gross income and you're going to pay some taxes, and then that's going to leave you with your net income. And we've discussed this. Net income, your disposable income. Well, we learned that we can separate this into some buckets. We called it categorized allocation, yeah? And we said that you have obligations, that you have luxuries, and that you have savings and investment. Well, if you recall, obligations critically included debt payment. Obligations are all about protecting your reputation, your honor, and your physical person, right? It's about survival and honor. Well, if you're taking on debt, you have to pay that back. So let's think about this from a systems lens. You have income coming in, you're paying taxes, so you've got some net income that's left over. That can go to obligations and luxuries. This is current you. And it can go to savings and investment. This was future you. Well, it's really easy to see that if you're not careful and you take on a lot of bad debt, you might be in a pretty big amount of trouble really quickly. Because look, the more debt you take on, the higher your debt payments go. The higher your debt payments go, the more obligations are taking up. The bigger part of your income obligations take up. Well, the more money that's going here, the less money you have for here. So if you're not careful, you're going to see your debt payments go up and this bucket take up a lot more of your income. And if you're not careful, you might actually be starving future you. Okay. There's also a little bit of a feedback loop that's involved too. If you think about it this way, if you take on debt, you're going to have to pay interest. This interest lowers the amount of income you have for consumption. Well, if you think about this, if you have light debt, or if you have a very low amount of debt relative to your income, that's okay. But you can imagine a situation where a person starts accruing a lot more debt, and that this debt becomes a much greater part of their income. So the interest payments become a bigger part of their income. And now they say, oh no, we've got less money available for, the things that you have to actually get through in life. You've got less free cash available for your rent and for your food and for your transport and for your insurance, for having a bit of fun. And certainly you starve future you. This is not good. Well, what can happen is if you're not careful, if your amount of income goes down because, sorry, your income's not going down. If the proportion of income available for consumption goes down because you're paying a lot more debt interest, well, you may find yourself needing now to borrow even more money. And uh-oh, when you borrowed more, now you've got more debt. And now you've got more interest. And now your free cash flow falls even further, and you're strapped even more, and you borrow even more, and your debt goes up. And this is not good. And it can get even worse because remember, the interest that you pay is based on the interest rate, what we call the APR, the annual percentage rate. Well, the riskier it gets, the riskier lending money to you becomes, the less trustworthy you seem to be with money, the more debt trouble you get into, the higher your interest rates go. You miss a payment on a credit card, your interest rate skyrockets. And now you got a double whammy because now you're having to borrow more, which adds to your debt, but now your interest rate goes up. So the amount of interest that you're paying goes even higher, leaving even less money for consumption, forcing you to now borrow even more money. And if you're not careful, friends, you're going to be on a treadmill that's going to be real difficult to get off. So that's kind of an opening look at the systems lens of credit. I want to point out to you that in general, we can sort of categorize credit into two broad categories. So there are two very broad types, categories, classifications of credit. One of them we call open-ended credit, open-ended credit, and the other we call closed-end credit. Both of these are still credit, they're still debt, they're still using someone else's money to consume today and then having to pay them back later. But there's a little bit of difference in them. So let's talk slightly about that. Open-ended credit is basically, we also call this revolving credit. This is basically credit cards. There's other forms as well. But open-ended credit is basically like a credit card. You're allowed to purchase pretty much anything you want from any retailer. You're allowed to charge at any level up to your credit limit. When you have a balance at the end of the month, you can either pay it all off or just pay the minimum or pay an amount in between. And when you pay down some of your credit card debt, your credit card balance goes down, and that then increases your available credit to charge later. So you charge, you pay, you charge, your pay, and it revolves. So this is credit card payment. Sorry, this is credit card as a tool. Open-ended revolving credit. When we talk about closed-end credit, we're talking more about loans as you would traditionally use them. These are loans that are often tied to the purchase of a big thing, like a mortgage to buy a house, or a car loan, or student loans. These are called closed-end credit because the big idea here is these loans here are only for that one thing. When you take a mortgage, it's got to be used for that house. When you take on a car loan, it's got to be used for that car. The loan is directly tied to the item. That's not the case over here. With credit cards, you can charge it on anything. But with the loan is tied to the specific item. And not only is that tied to it, but the amount is set. In other words, if you're going to buy a house that costs $100,000 and you're going to take out a mortgage for $80,000, the loan is $80,000. The loan is in the exact amount to buy the thing that you want to buy. And then, whereas with credit cards, we said you can basically pay the balance in full or you can pay the minimum. You have a lot of flexibility in your payments. When it comes to traditional loans, not only is the amount that you're taking out set, but your payment schedule is also set. You have to pay a certain amount every month, and that's the way it goes. You can pay a bit more if you want to accelerate the payoff, which is a great idea, but you can't just say, hey, this month I'm going to pay a little bit less. Okay? So these are our two main types of credit. Open-ended, revolving in the form of credit cards, and closed-end, also called installment or just regular loans, which for most people would be student loans, car loans, mortgages. Maybe if you ever go and buy like furniture, you can go to a furniture store and they'll have like an installment loan or a loan for that furniture. Okay? So those are your two broad types of loans and debt. I want to introduce you to another idea here. When you talk about debt, a lot of people immediately say it's a no-go, or some people say whatever. I want you to develop awareness and I want you to develop nuance. So I want to ask a question now. Can debt actually be good? In other words, can we distinguish between good debt and bad debt? And I think the answer would be yes. Let's remember that when you take on debt, you are acquiring an asset now and a liability now. In other words, when you borrow money from somebody, you get something today, the asset, and you also get the obligation to pay it back. So let's focus on those two things. What I would offer to you is, in thinking about the idea of is there good debt, you really want to focus on the asset that you are acquiring. And the fundamental question you're going to ask is the asset appreciating, meaning growing in value, or is it depreciating, meaning falling in value? Remember, not all assets are created alike. Some of them fall in value over time. Some of them rise in value over time. Maybe a simpler way to think about this, when you think about the asset that you're acquiring, maybe it comes down to this. An appreciating asset, we can say, generates future wealth. A depreciating asset does not. So if you think about it back up here, this idea that, okay, we're going to take on a liability that we have to pay down later on, to get an asset, it might make some sense if the asset grows in value over time. So I want to encourage you to have a very nuanced view of debt. I would offer to you that good debt would be debt for assets that appreciate over time. It would be borrowing money today to create future greater wealth in the future. What might that entail? Well, possibly a mortgage to buy a house, because we can expect houses to go up in value over time. Possibly a student loan, because this increases your human capital and your future earning potential. So student loans, depending on how much the loan is and depending on what you're going to study, could be a good idea. We can also say that for some people, maybe a business loan. Now, this is a bit more iffy, but let's say that you already have an established business and you've been successful and you've got a good track record. Taking on a loan to build and scale something that you've already proven works, this can be good too. So don't be afraid of debt. Be nuanced with debt. Be smart with debt. Remember, we're building awareness, building intuition. Bad debt would be like everything else. So items that depreciate. So this is when we talk about car loans. Terrible idea. The banking industry wants you to like them. The car industry wants you to like them. But from a financial perspective, car loans, terrible idea. Because cars are depreciating assets. They fall in value the moment you drive off the lot with that new car. You're now driving an asset that's worth less and is falling in value over time, but you're still paying a lot of interest on that. Any debt that you take on to fuel consumption, any debt that you take on to purchase luxuries, any debt that you take on to pay for that vacation, these are all bad ideas. Okay, just bad ideas. Now, you might have a good experience and great memories, and that's fine. But from a financial lens, you're left with no real asset, but you're left with a big debt payment. And remember that debt payment is opportunity cost, because every dollar that future you is paying in interest is a dollar that future you cannot invest and grow in this wealth building system. Okay? So that's bad debt. And I guess just to be real clear, I'll also put here in red, not highly, I don't want to put that. So we had good debt and bad debt. And how about we analyze really, really bad debt? You think, wow, what can be worse than bad debt? You say, really, really bad debt is worse. And this would be high interest loans. In other words, when you have loans with an APR of greater than like 20%, that is real risky and real bad news. This, by the way, this APR being greater than 20%, that is the case for most credit cards. So carrying credit card balances month to month to month, bad idea. Okay? So now we know a bit about debt. We know good debt and bad debt. But I want to give you some more nuance, because you see, some people would say, well, okay, Eric, you said that good debt is for items that grow in value, and a house will grow in value, and education will grow in value, etc. So you might be mistaken and be thinking, well, then hell, I'll just take out a lot of huge good debt. I'll buy a huge house and I'll keep on going to school. Well, that's not necessarily a good idea. So now that we understand good debt and bad debt, let's ask a question. What's a responsible level of debt? Let's assume that you're going to take on only good debt. What's a responsible level of debt? What's a level of debt that is manageable so that you can balance current you and future you and not be crushed by the opportunity cost of interest? So let's talk here about debt ratios. And I want to introduce you just to a couple of basic ideas when it comes to debt. Let's talk about debt ratios. Um, there's a few. The simplest one is just a straightforward debt ratio. And this is a ratio between your total debts divided by your total assets. This ratio is your total debts as a function of your total assets. Okay? If you have any debt, you're going to want to be keeping an eye on that. Okay? If this ratio gets into trouble, in other words, if your amount of debt rises relative to your asset base, this means that you're getting more and more and more into a dangerous red zone. A couple more concrete ratios. Here's one called the debt payment ratio. The debt payment ratio is equal to your monthly debt payments divided by your monthly net income. Okay, your debt payment ratio is your monthly debt payments, how much you have to pay per month on your car loan, your mortgage, your credit card, your everything. Actually, no, I'm going to take that back. Not your mortgage. We're taking mortgage out right now. Your debt payment ratio is all of your other debts, student loan debt, car loan debt, credit card debt, all those other debts, the monthly payments as a function, as a percentage of your net income. Notice that this one here sort of hints a little bit to this idea here. Okay, so we're tied into our system. Now, in a perfect world, this is as low as possible. The current wisdom, the current rule of thumb in personal finance is that your debt payment ratio should be 20% max. In other words, for every $100 you have of monthly net income, you should have a max of $20 in debt payments. That's the rule of thumb, but even that to me is pretty damn dangerous. I mean, if you're putting 20% of your net income to debt payments, you haven't even yet touched food, transport, shelter, clothing, future you. So, okay, I'll agree that 20% max is a decent rule of thumb, but if you're at 20% on your debt payment ratio, you're looking at a pretty rough go because you're now left with only 80% of your income, your disposable income, for everything else. And we learned up here that if you're not careful, high debt leads to high interest, which could lead to more borrowing, and very quickly, your debt ratio is way above 20%, and you've got a big problem. Okay? So that's that one. And then our final ratio, we're going to call this the mortgage debt service ratio. This is if you own a home. If you own a home, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a later lecture on home ownership, your mortgage debt service ratio is equal to what we call your PITI divided by your monthly gross income. Notice it's gross income here. What is PITI? Well, PITI is just a little acronym that we use in finance to talk about the cost of owning a home. PITI stands for principal and interest and taxes and insurance. Pity is a nice rough proxy for the cost of owning a home. As we'll learn later, the principal and interest, this basically means your mortgage payment, because your mortgage payment includes both principal payback and interest payments for the home loan. Okay? And then taxes and insurance. The rule of thumb here is that this should be 33% max. In other words, you do not want to have more than 1/3 of your income going to your home. If you get that, if you go above that, you may be falling into the trap of what we say in finance of buying too much house, meaning you kind of fell for the idea that you need a bigger house, and you now have a home that is so big, that was so expensive, that the payments on it are taking up more than 33% of your gross income. Why is this a problem? Well, once again, the issues tied to home ownership, your insurance, your taxes, and your mortgage, they all go here. You start buying too much house, you go into too much debt because of your home, a lot of your cash goes here, leaving very little cash for the other things and usually starving future you. Okay, so we want to be thoughtful. We want to build awareness. Okay, that right there is debt ratios. The final thing that I want to discuss in this foundation, I want to discuss your credit score. Everybody has a credit score. Now, there's a couple of companies that offer them, but the company that started it all, and which we still default to, it's called the Fair Isaac Company, the Fair Isaac Corporation. And they invented this credit score, the Fair Isaac Corporation. And that's why today we still refer to your credit score as your FICO. So you may have heard about your credit score or your FICO. Your FICO, your credit score, is basically a 3-digit number. It goes from 350 at the low end to 800 or so at the high end. It might be actually be 850, I think. Yeah, it's 850. Sorry about that. It goes from 350 to 850. This number is a huge indicator of your financial trustworthiness. And even though I'm not a big fan of how this game works, I'm kind of skeptical, it is still something that you need to understand, okay? Generally speaking, your credit worthiness is going to be dictated based on your FICO score. Now, lots of places use lots of different kind of brackets, but here's a very common bracket. A credit score of less than 580 would consider you to be of poor credit. Credit scores of 580 to 669, we might call fair credit. Credit scores of 670 to 739, you now have what we call good credit. 740 to 799 would be called very good credit. And the gold standard, which I want all of you to shoot for, a credit of 800 plus, this is exceptional credit. Why is that so important? Well, here's a big reason. Your credit score is a big determinant in your access to lots of the other pieces of financial success. So, for example, your credit score will impact the interest rate that you have to pay on your credit cards or on your mortgage or on your car loan. You see, lenders hate risk. So if I'm a lender and you come and apply for a loan from me, and I say, wow, your credit score is only 580 to 669, that's a not good credit score. You're riskier. And the only way that I'm going to take on more risk is by charging you a higher interest rate. So we would say that in the world of credit, more risk leads to a higher interest rate. And you guys know the TVM rules. When the interest rates go higher, the PMT goes higher, and the cycle keeps going. So you really want to cultivate, put together, carefully craft a strong credit score and protect that son of a bitch like the precious little baby that it is. They're very fragile. You want to take the time to build one responsibly and keep it high. How do you do that? Well, let's wrap this lecture up by discussing what are the determinants, what are the criteria of a credit score? And there's 5. Number 1, your payment history. Your payment history is 35% of your credit score. This means, are you making your payments on time? Number 2, your credit utilization. Your credit utilization is equal to, basically, it's kind of a rough proxy, but all of your balances divided by your credit limit. So let's say that you have a credit card and your credit card has a $1,000 credit limit and you have a balance of $250. Your balance divided by your credit limit is your credit utilization rate. This accounts for 30% of your FICO. The general rule, FICO wants this credit utilization, they want it to be less than 30%. I personally think that you should gun for less than 10%, which once again implies having responsible spending habits, being thoughtful about what you buy, okay? Number 3, the length of your credit history. In other words, for how long have you been in the credit game? This is 15%. Number 4, your credit mix. This is, do you just have revolving credit cards or do you have a mixture of types of credit with a student loan, maybe a car loan, a mortgage, credit cards, whatever? By the way, for the record, I hate this one. I think this is BS because this one accounts for 10% of your FICO. So basically, to me, this is BS. But it basically means that FICO is saying if you want a better score, take on more types of debt. So, there's a little bit of weirdness here that you got to be aware of. And then number 5, any new credit inquiries. In other words, when you apply for a loan or a credit card, that's considered a hard search, a hard hit. That's a new credit inquiry. That's 10%. Okay? So that's what your FICO is. Those are the 5 things that influence it. If you want to build a good FICO, what can you do? Well, number 1, never, ever miss a payment. You have to pay on time. You don't have to pay it in full, although you should. But you don't have to pay it in full. You can pay the minimum. You shouldn't. But you can get away with paying the minimum. But you cannot miss a payment. So what does that mean? Well, once again, back to our systems thinking, you're going to want to incorporate some automation into your system. I've showed you in previous lectures a money map. Link your credit cards to your checking account. Automatically pay. Set up an auto payment on the due date. You just got to do it once. Remember, you're an architect, and then you're good. Never miss a payment. Number 2, keep your utilization low. Use your cards responsibly. And number 3, because length of credit history is a factor, if you don't already have a credit card now, consider applying for one that has a low credit limit just so you can start doing simple charges and building it up. And then, whether you apply for one now for your first card or you have a card, don't cancel your oldest card, because your oldest card is what triggers the length of your history. Okay? So, that, my friends, is an intro to credit. In our next video, we'll talk a little bit about loans. Then we'll talk about credit cards. Okay? Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you next time.